Well, I'm very excited today because joining me on the podcast is the one and only internationally acclaimed Kim Golding. Hello.
Hello, Lisa. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. It is so lovely to have you on the podcast because I met you in person in
Yes,
Australia.
we did.
Now, that must have been last year.
Yeah, a bit over a year ago, wasn't it? It's gone so fast. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been to two of those events. And the
Mm,
first event that I went to, I think there were literally 3 people from the UK.
mm.
And I think last time it had grown and there were more people from the UK. But to have, in fact, there were a couple of UK speakers because there was Peter from the Anna
Peter as well. Yeah, yeah.
And yourself. And you were one of the main speakers along with Gabor Mate, Ed Tronick. I'm just throwing all the names out there so people really appreciate who I have on the podcast today.
Well, I felt, yeah, I'm not sure. I felt I should have been in that exalted company, I must say.
Did it
felt
feel a bit
a stretch for
intimidating,
me.
actually?
Oh, yeah, it's very intimidating. Yeah, to go there and be with those names that you read their books and hear it. And I know I've written books and people read my books, but I don't feel like that sort of person, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on the route that people have into that work. And I mean, you were working as a clinical psychologist for 30
Yes,
years and have only been
yeah,
working for yourself and in your own business really since 2015, which is probably quite a different route to some of the
yeah,
people on that stage.
definitely. Still feeling a humble clinician, really.
And yet you're
But
so amazing. So I'm thinking today we're going to talk about DDP.
yep,
And I know that people will be really interested to learn about that journey and learn about that work around working with children who've experienced trauma. And, anything else that comes up really. So
yep.
how did you get here, Kim, is probably the very first question.
Okay, it's probably a long answer. I I trained as a clinical psychologist, as you say, and I worked initially, actually, I specialised in working with children with learning disabilities, particularly where children were born with difficulties like Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, those sorts of difficulties. So my career has always been focused on supporting parents, right from just as I qualified, that's what I went into. So although I obviously do work as a therapist as well, my heart is with the parents and helping them to parent children with whatever needs they have. So that's the start of my journey, and that took me into doing a lot of parenting support around those particular developmental difficulties. Then life changes, usually because my husband got made redundant and we had to move country. So then you look for a different job and do different things. And I ended up moving to Oxford in the United Kingdom with a focus on, again, working with children with disabilities, but also with working with children on the edge of care and working with parents to try and help those children stay with their parents. Then, following another redundancy, we moved again. And this is a long answer, I'm sorry, but this will get to where you're asking. So we moved to Worcestershire, which is where I live now. And I applied for a job to set up a service which would be supporting carers of children looked after and ultimately adopted. But we started off with children in foster care and residential care, some kinship care. So I had this opportunity to set up a brand new service. Again, it was very much a supporting parents service. And I needed a model to work within that would work for that service. And my previous models had been very CBT orientated, very behavioural. And when I went and started talking to the foster carers, it very quickly became apparent that the tools in my tool bag weren't what they needed and that they needed something else. I had an interest in attachment theory, but I had never really focused on applying it in the way that I subsequently did. So I needed help. I needed someone to guide me, and Dan Hughes came into my life at that time. he was over in London doing an introductory day to DDP, so I went down to see what it was all about. This was kind of early 2000s, so when he was, fairly new to coming over here. He'd been brought in by Family Futures in London, and I listened to him talking and knew that that was what we needed. This was the missing bit for our service. So that's how I got into DDP.
That's an amazing journey, and it's always wonderful to hear when somebody is working within one model and recognises that actually that's not what is needed, because when, in the words of Maya Angelou, although somebody tried to quote me the other day on Twitter, which made me go, what me? When we know better, we do better.
Yes.
But what was it about DDP that really...
Well, yeah, the missing bit. I mean, and I think it's really important to be clear, there's nothing wrong with CBT and behavioural psychology, and that whole discipline. It's provided a lot of strands to myself as a clinical psychologist, and I still draw on those strands. And I think sometimes we start to dichotomise things a bit too much. Yeah, I'm very eclectic in the way I work, very integrative. That's the way, I think it's the way clinical psychologists in this country are trained, and it's a way that really suits me. But when I was developing the service and starting to work with particularly the foster carers, which is where I started, and starting talking to them what they needed, what became very clear was this wasn't about how do we manage this behaviour. This was about how do we help these children feel safe with us. And that actually behaviour management was the last thing they needed, despite the very big challenges these children presented. It wasn't the behaviours that was getting in the way, it was their lack of trust, their lack of safety with the caregivers. And I didn't know how to help them with that bit. My ways of working were very focused on how to help children who were ultimately secure. They knew they were loved, they knew that their parents had their back, but for whatever reasons, their behaviours were challenging, and we could go in, whether that came from a parental insecurity or whether that came from difficulties within the child. Because that basic security was there, we could go in and work at that behavioural level and relatively easily shift things. And this wasn't happening with this population of children because of their beginnings and their deep, and now we understand even more about the biological level, that this is wired into the nervous system, their deep lack of trust in their caregiving, their caregivers, I should say. So I didn't know quite what to do with that. I could see the problem, but I didn't know the solution. And I think finding and discovering DDP gave me a model. Not fair to say it gives you a solution. It gives you a way of being that can help these children over time. It's not a fix. There isn't a fix out there. I think that's a big myth that we hold, that you can get some therapy or can get some intervention and everything will be okay. This is more about how do we find a way of being that will take us on the journey that the child needs for as long as the child needs it, and the parents need for as long as the parents need it.
And ultimately, how does that child go on that journey? Because, of course, the reality is that those particular children really, really struggle in our education system, in family systems, and that is going to have a huge impact upon those children in terms of their trajectory. We know the statistics around school exclusion for looked after children and previously looked after children, and they're high.
And we know that, although schools have been on their own journey of change, we know that schools traditionally focus on behaviour and not connection and security. So we've got the same, as I was finding in the families, that we need to change the whole focus. We need to get the foundation right before we can get the behavioural support right.
And that's really the kind of hub of the work that I try and do in a school, adopting the ideology and idea that if it's a whole school approach, then all children will benefit, rather than just focusing on those few children who are really struggling, to enable that school to feel that they have, a real need to adopt an approach that focuses on safety, security, calmness, regulation, and all of those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
So DDP, do you want to just explain a little bit
What it
about
is.
the model? Yes.
In a nutshell. Yes, okay, well, let's start with the name. DDP stands for Dyadic Developmental Psychotherapy, or Dyadic Developmental Practice, or Dyadic Developmental Parenting. And those, all of that becomes DDP, which is the neatness of it. The original term was Dyadic Developmental Psychotherapy because this was originally developed by Dan Hughes in America, a clinical psychologist working in America with adopted foster children as a therapy, as a therapeutic intervention for these children. As we've developed it over time, it became more and more apparent that to Dan, and obviously ultimately to us as well, working alongside him, was that a lot of the work needs to be done at the parenting level. Yeah. And as you're pointing out, at the other environments that the children are in, like the school level. So actually, DDP was very quickly in its history of development, particularly in the UK, I'm thinking really, as we started developing it in the UK, we very quickly began to realise that we weren't just talking about bringing a therapy into this country, we were talking about bringing a whole practice model. And that practice model could go out to work with parents, could go out to work with schools, with teachers, with community support groups, youth workers. And actually it's a way of being to help children form those connections, develop that security that they need in their life surrounding them, not just in a therapy room an hour a week or whatever you can offer them. So with Dan's consent, we started to adopt this practice model terminology. So DDP has always been a psychotherapy, but also became a practice. Yeah, my particular work, as I've developed it, was working on the parenting. That's where most of my writing has gone into, is to how do we become DDP informed in parenting. So Dyadic Developmental Parenting became part of that branch. Ultimately, what we're talking about is a model which focuses on building security and building emotional connection, understanding the emotional experience of the child, of the parent, of the teacher, whoever in that whole array of networks around these children we're working with, understanding their emotional experience, understanding when that experience leads them to become defensive with the child or the child with the parent, which of course gets in the way of connection and security, and helping the adults to move back into connection and what we call an open and engaged attitude rather than a defensive attitude. So the children can also move out of defensiveness and become open and engaged within the relationship. And that's the foundation of security and trust.
So you're looking at how do you create something, because I mean I'm always sort of talking about recovery journeys and you know, and saying, you know, it's more than 6 sessions in CAMS, you know. This stuff takes a long time,
years and years.
So your work's really about working with all of those people so that they can be developing that outside of the relationship that they're having with you in a therapeutic setting. And what sort of key, I mean, certainly when I'm looking at seeking safety, I'm definitely using the work of Stephen Porges and expanding the system. I mean, what kind of, if you're lucky enough to have a school in front of you, because I don't know if you do direct work with schools. What kind of, I mean, certainly drawing upon Stephen Porges' work, what kind of ideas do you give schools when you're working with them in terms of adopting that approach within a whole school setting?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm very heavily influenced by the work of Louise Bomber in this country as well. So Louise's attachment-informed schoolwork and going in and helping the whole school become more attachment-informed is a really important part of this. I guess when I work within schools, or it's mainly at a training and consultation level, I'm really focusing on the relationships that the teachers are having with the children, but within the context of a whole school approach to which is attachment aware and trauma aware. So the DDP influence to that is how to help the teachers, teaching assistants, all the staff within the school understand their own behaviours and reactions, their own nervous systems. That's where the Stephen Porges' work is so helpful, understanding what's happening for them internally, how they're feeling, how they're thinking, when they're defensive, when they're open engaged, and noticing how the child impacts on that. And then taking that responsibility as the adult here, we're the ones who are responsible to move ourselves back into an open engaged state so that we can make sense of the child, and by making sense of what's going on for the child while they're behaving as they are, why they're ducking out of school or fighting or whatever it is that is causing some problems within the school environment for that child and for those staff, taking that responsibility to slow down and make sense of what's going on for the child, because only when we understand it can we know how to move forward. And one of the big messages of the DDP model is slow down. In my training, I always talk about slow down to get there quicker. Yeah, and in my supervisions, I'm always saying we've got to slow down, we've got to slow it down, because we always miss steps. The very typical way of being with children is to see them behaving in a particular way, think, for all the good motivations, I don't want them to behave this way, I want them to behave that way, and to be trying to make them behave that way. We know it will be better for them. We know they'll be healthier and happier ultimately if they behave in ways that are less aggressive or less rude or more engaged with learning or whatever it is. So we have all the right motivations, but it's like we're taking the child and saying, you will do this, without understanding why is the child not. And if we don't take that time to think, step back and think, what is going on here? What is this all about? Okay, that's why they're doing this. Then we can find a way forward, which instead of is saying to the child, you must, is saying, work with me, we'll figure this out together. Yeah, we'll figure out how, ultimately I as the adult know what's best for you, but I can help you come with me on that. Does that make sense?
It does, and it strikes me that one of the greatest difficulties, whether you're a leader in a school and you're wanting to bring your staff team with you, or whether you're a designated teacher and you really want everyone to be on board because you feel really passionate about everything, or a Senko or a group of teachers, whatever it is, that actually the real challenge is how you move from knowing to being. That space in the middle is where the deep personal work can be done, and either that's a space you can enter willingly, or it's one where there's going to be much resistance because of our own experiences. And I do hear often people saying, oh, we've done that, yeah, we've done attachment, yeah, we've done whatever it is, and which I'm sure as well as I do that it's not really ever something you've done.
No, that's right.
But that space from knowing the stuff to actually responding in a very different way, the way of being that's required, is a place that can be very difficult for people, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's not the way we were raised. It's not typical to our culture. If you think back over generations, think back to Victorian times where children had to be, seen and not heard, and parents did to the children. Yeah. And, we have a long cultural history of parenting children in this way. And this turns it on its head, because actually this requires us being much more in tune with what's going on internally with the child and with ourselves, rather than just holding on to our external vision, if you like, of what we want the children to be, how we want the children to be, which is, again, all with good intentions and good motivations. But this requires us to step back from that immediacy of that and think, what's happening within me that is making this difficult for me? This child, maybe a child has been rude to me, yeah, and I feel very frustrated with that child. I don't like that child at that moment. I don't particularly want to engage with that child. Why am I having that response to this rudeness? You have to start with yourself. What's that about? Sometimes that involves thinking about other relationships in our life and how the child has taken us back to memories of previous relationships, which is, we call that triggers, we call those vulnerabilities. Sometimes it's just understanding what's going on in the moment. But we need to, first of all, think about ourselves, in order to be able to stay open and engaged to that child. Obviously, it may not be in that moment, right at that moment, because we've got to deal with whatever's in front of us. But we have to reflect on that. We have to become more reflective about that particular child always makes me respond this way. What is that about? That allows us then to put that to the background and then to focus on the child. I wonder what's going on for the child that leads her to feel the need to be rude to me. What's that about? What's she feeling and thinking? What beliefs is she holding that is making her become defensive, or him, which is leading to this rudeness? Now I need to make sense of that. Once I've made sense of that, and understanding, curiosity and understanding opens the door to empathy. It's really hard to empathize with someone we don't understand. Once we have empathy for the child, we can then start to think about a way forward. And the child will be feeling and experiencing us as interested in them. Not just interested in their behaviour.
Yes. And the reality is that if you're doing that in a room full of lots of children,
that's
and
hard.
it's a new way of doing things, the reality is that is incredibly exhausting. And much of what we do has to be about schools as organisations, as communities, being able to hold that space for the teachers in that way.
And being realistic about that. You can't do that all the time. But building in times for reflection, allowing yourself to be in an environment, allowing the environment to support the reflection is really important. So a school atmosphere which says time for reflection, time to think together about children, time to think with someone about yourself and your responses is a really important part of what we need in school. And that time isn't always often allowed, really. So it's a cultural shift in recognising what the adults need in order to be giving the children what the children need.
Yeah, and actually, good reflective practice is something that we ought to be doing all the time. I was listening to somebody on reflective practice yesterday, and he was talking about how this idea that it's an add-on, or and he said what you're saying, if you're saying that you don't have time to be reflective, is that actually you're just going to do what you're doing without thinking. I mean, and how frightening is that? And so I think,
and we can see that on the world stage, can't we?
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So I think that's a clear message really around reflective practice, which we know historically is not something that's part of education, and that's changing in the same way that supervision is being much more utilised in an education setting, and those spaces support that ability to understand that reflection is part of what we should be doing all the time. But if you're new to reflecting, it's a very different way of being in the world, isn't it?
It is. It's not a way we haven't been brought up to do that, because culturally that has not been part of the parenting of ourselves. The schools we attended, it's something that feels very different. And different people have different levels of skill and capacity to do this. Again, often going back to how they were raised, as well as genetic factors in that. So it can be quite testing. It's exposing, because once you start reflecting, you're reflecting on your own vulnerabilities. And sometimes it's easier to hide those away and not look at those. But this is what we mean by the DDP idea of slowing down. It's building in times to understand ourselves and understand that other before we decide on a way forward. Yeah. Again, just emphasizing that doesn't mean in the moment. Sometimes we just have to be. We have to do. You know, when training, I talk about if Joe is hitting Fred. You know, there's no point reflecting and letting them carry on hitting each other. We have to get in and stop the hitting. So it's not it's I think you'll use the word a way of being. It's a way of being that we cultivate. It's always there in the background, and often we're bringing it to the foreground, but sometimes we just have to get on and do and leave the reflection till later, and that's also okay. But the reflective is always there. It's an invitation to keep being curious. I mean, Dan Hughes came up with the attitude of PACE. We haven't mentioned PACE: playfulness, acceptance, curiosity and empathy, which is a very neat acronym for the way of being that you and I have just been spending time talking about. It's a nice, easy way to kind of remember what we're trying to do. And the ACE of PACE particularly is what we've been talking about. Playfulness is also a really important part of our relationships, but perhaps something that is easier to get a grip on. I think the acceptance, curiosity and empathy, and you know, how we stay curious and reflective, which means we have to be open and engaged, not defensive. How we stay curious and how we use that to inform our understanding, our acceptance of, and acceptance is about the child's internal world, not about their behaviour. We don't necessarily accept their behaviour, but we may accept the motivation that led to that behaviour, the feelings, the thinkings, the worries, the fears. And we accept that is their truth. It's neither right nor wrong. It just is the way they feel, the way they think. We have empathy for that. And that's the starting point then for thinking with them about, and how can we change the way that's expressed through your behaviour. And often when people understand us, our behaviour changes quite easily.
And I'm just thinking while you're talking about playfulness and secondary schools, and I'm wondering how playful secondary schools are able, are willing, are configured to be.
Okay. Think about playfulness as enjoying relationship. Then it becomes much easier to imagine how that is a part of any school life. Yeah. Teachers work to enjoy their relationships with their kids. Yeah. The best teachers will want that. They want to, you know, obviously some children are easier to enjoy than others, but the best teachers will be striving to build relationship with the children and to enjoy those relationships. Once you start enjoying a relationship, you're naturally playful within that relationship. It's not a big thing. It's just about a joy, a fun in our relationship together. And I know when witnessing my children go through schools, the best teachers, the teachers they responded to best, were the ones that had that natural playful element to them.
Yeah. And it's that enjoyment of relationship.
Yeah.
I think that is such a nice way of thinking about it. Yeah. So Kim, where can people find you? Because I don't know if you do lots of public events or if you're mainly privately commissioned, or what's the best way of people accessing your work?
Well, I do have a website. I can't tell you the website address off the top of my head, but it's there. If you Google me, you'll find me. There's also a DDP website with all things DDP, lots of resources on there. That's ddpnetwork.org. I do get commissioned to do conferences, trainings. I do a lot of DDP training, as you can imagine. I do consultations to various places, and I do a lot of supervision. That's what I'm doing now. Majority of the time.
And you've done quite a lot of international stuff, haven't you?
I've been really lucky to be invited. I've been invited out to Australia, New Zealand a number of times now, so I've done quite a lot of work out there. I've been to Estonia, I've been to Lithuania, so I've had some really exciting opportunities to go and bring these ideas into other countries. There's lots of countries out there who are interested in the DDP model and thinking about how they can bring it in. So other of my colleagues going out to different countries. So we are we are on a world stage, that's for sure. Yeah.
Well, I mean, certainly with the what can only be described of, I guess, as the diaspora of human beings um, moving into other countries who are seeking asylum, who those children have endured so much disruption and traumatic experiences and events. It's unsurprising to me that this is something that is not being rolled out. It's so relevant everywhere. It's not just thinking about children who've, you know, in our fostering and adoption arenas, but also thinking about those children who have been, you know, fleeing from war. And
yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're ultimately talking about the human condition, aren't we? You know, if you look at where we are in the world at the moment, there's a lot of human condition out there that isn't doing so well. And I think, you know, don't want to get too evangelical about this, but if we could all connect more and take the time to understand each other, I think the world would be a better place. I mean, we talk about changing the world one pace at a time. That's our little phrase we say to ourselves, you know, but, you know, connection, security, the things that these developmentally traumatized children have struggled to achieve. They've been so burnt by their attempts at connection and security, which innately they've reached out for from birth, that, you know, they're the children who are going to struggle most to feel comfortable with security and connection. But beyond those children, we all need more connection in our lives. We all need more understanding. You know, if everyone just took the time to understand before reacting, before behaving, before deciding a way forward, the world would be a better place. There's no doubt about it. And it's really sad, isn't it, to see that our world is becoming less connected, more reactive, more defensive. It seems to me, you know, my own opinion, but it seems to me at the moment that we're going in the opposite direction in a lot of ways, and that's really, really sad.
Who knew that globalization would actually disconnect us more rather than connect us more? And we don't have these things, these, as you said, innate, these biologically driven needs to belong and to connect. We don't have that being demonstrated to us in our world leaders, and that is hugely problematic.
I think it is, you know, and Stephen Porges talks about social connection is a biological imperative.
Yeah.
You know, we're not just talking about something that's nice. We're talking about something that's essential to us as a human species. Yeah, and yet we're losing it. You know, I know Dan Siegel's talked about that. Bruce Perry's talked about that. You know, and we need to listen to this. This is, you know, we've gone way beyond where we started, you know, but this is about us as an evolving species on this planet. And if we're going to look after ourselves and the planet, then we have to take notice of our physiology, and we've evolved to connect. So why culturally are we doing so much to disconnect at the moment? Now I feel I've gone into politics here.
Well, it is political. I'm very comfortable with being political about these matters because it is political. And interestingly, and I can't remember who said it, but I saw a wonderful statement someone had said, you know, it was around this idea of success. And that this had been very confused with, and I don't want to use the word bigly, but it's very hard not to, because I'm thinking of Donald Trump with his bigliest. But, you know, this idea that if you're the biggest and the richest and the tallest, but actually the way that that we will survive, the survival of the species is actually dependent upon our ability to connect with each other. And if we don't do something about that, then we are going to create some serious problems for us as a species.
Yes, absolutely, and already have done, haven't we?
Yeah.
You know, so the whole climate change agenda that's you know, so prevalent at the moment, we have to take notice of. You know, we have to start bringing ourselves together and working together to make the world a different place. And yes, we can do that in an individual way, and you know, that's the DDP model is helping us to do that within schools, with parents, in therapy. So on an individual level, we can bring some of those ideas in, and we're finding how effective they are to help children feel more secure. But let's also learn lessons from that beyond the individual level.
Yeah, great messages to leave there with our listeners. And I'd just like to thank you so much for joining me today, Kim.
It's always been great. You're very welcome.
Thank you.